Well, hey everybody, how we doing today? These notes are all about cardiac and smooth muscle today. So let's get started. Make sure you write this down in your notebook on the input side, which is the right-hand side of your notebook. And your essential question, here it is. Here's the question for today. What do cardiac and smooth muscle tissues have in common that is completely different than skeletal muscle? As we go through these notes, you will be able to answer that question. Make sure you write it down also in your notebook. Okay, here we go. All right, let's look here at the anatomy of cardiac muscle. We studied this a little bit before when we studied our histology unit and tissues and stuff like that, but we're going to go into it in more detail today. We can see here that cardiac muscle fibers, or cells, are striated, which means they have those stripes, just like the skeletal muscle tissue does. They're short, they're not long. They're quadrangular shaped, which means they have kind of a rectangular shape, but then they branch off. The muscle fibers of cardiac tissue does branch. And there's a single located nucleus in the cardiac muscle fiber. Okay, the cells of cardiac muscle tissue are connected by the intercalated discs, if you remember, with gap junctions. And those gap junctions are what keeps those cardiac muscle fibers together and keeps the cardiac muscle held together, especially with all that pressure as the heart is pumping all that blood. There are same arrangements of thick and thin filaments as skeletal muscle. Okay, so we do have the actin and myosin in cardiac muscle fibers, as we saw with skeletal muscle. All right. Remember those desmosomes and the gap junctions that we had discussed a long time ago, in the intercalated discs that keep it together. All right, some more information about cardiac muscle versus skeletal muscle. Cardiac tissue, cardiac muscle fibers have more sarcoplasm, which means there's more space between the muscle fibers, and they also have more mitochondria, needs more energy. That's why it has to pump very, very hard. Cardiac muscle does. There are also very large transverse tubules located at the Z discs, and rather than at the A1 band junctions as in skeletal muscle. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is less well developed as skeletal muscle is, and there is limited intracellular calcium ion reserves. More of the calcium ion enters the cell from extracellular fluid during contraction. And the way that this works is, like I said, because cardiac muscle is able to produce such a high pressure with all the force that's involved, the extracellular fluid can flood into the muscle fibers with that calcium ion to replenish what's used up during the muscle contraction. This last point here, the prolonged delivery of the calcium ion into the sarcoplasm produces a contraction that lasts 10 to 15 times longer than the skeletal muscle fibers themselves. So it is a prolonged contraction. Those actin and myosin heads that when the contraction occurs, they'll they'll last a little bit longer, actually quite a bit longer than what skeletal muscle fibers do. And we can see some pictures showing some contrast between the skeletal muscle here, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Here, cardiac muscle in a more blown up kind of picture, we can see the striated muscle that has the thick and thin filaments, and we see that there are the T tubules with the terminal cisterns and the mitochondria there between each muscle fiber. The sarcolemma, still the same thing, that is the membrane that surrounds the muscle fibers, and thick and thin filaments that make up the myofibril. The T tubules here are located at the Z discs, and there is less sarcoplasmic reticulum than what we saw with skeletal muscle. Now, in terms of function or physiology of cardiac muscle tissue are autorhythmic cells, which means they automatically will contract. We don't have to stop and think about it like we have to when we go to move our arm, like we have to with our skeletal muscle. So autorhythmic cells also contract without stimulation. All right. Generally speaking, Our cardiac muscle tissue contracts 75 times per minute, and it needs lots and lots and lots of oxygen. It needs lots of oxygen in order for that to happen. Larger mitochondria in the cardiac muscle tissue generate ATP aerobically. Okay, so that's why we have to have all this oxygen, because this is an aerobic process. It has to have oxygen in order for it to happen. And sustained contraction is possible due to the slow calcium delivery. Okay, as the calcium is slow to be delivered, the channels for the extracellular fluid do stay open. It doesn't shut them off. Okay, and that keeps the contraction going for a longer period of time as compared to skeletal muscle. Now we're going to take a look at some smooth muscle, and we'll finish our discussion on the smooth muscle next time. There are two types of smooth muscle that we are going to focus upon. There's visceral smooth muscle tissue, and there's multi-unit smooth muscle tissue. Okay? Visceral, which you can probably deduce is a single unit kind of smooth muscle tissue. It's in the walls of our hollow viscera and small bowel viscera. It's autorhythmic. There are gap junctions between them that cause the fibers to contract in unison. And then in our multi-unit smooth muscle tissue, there are individual fibers with their own motor neuron ending. And these are found in our large arteries, such as the aorta and pulmonary artery. There are large airways, the erector pili muscles, your iris, and ciliary body. That's where these multi-unit smooth muscle tissue is found. Here's a microscopic image of smooth muscle tissue. We saw this one on the right whenever we studied our histology unit and looked at smooth muscle. And this is a different view here. It's a transverse section. Okay, so longitudinal means that the tissue was cut along with the cells, and transverse means it's a cross section. It's cutting like across into each of the cells that are involved here. Okay, and this is visceral, which is single unit smooth muscle tissue found in like your small bowel. It's small involuntary muscle cell. They taper at the ends. They're smooth in shape. That's why we call them smooth muscle. They're single, oval. They have one centrally located nucleus. They do not have T-tubules, which means they don't have the same structure as cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. And they have very little sarcoplasmic reticulum for calcium ion storage. To take a look further at the microscopic anatomy of smooth muscle, the thick and thin myofilaments are not orderly arranged, so there are no sarcomeres either. Okay, and it is not striated like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. The sliding thick and thin filaments do generate tension though, and this tension is transferred to intermediate filaments and dense bodies that are attached to the sarcolemma, and the muscle fiber contracts and twists into a helix as it shortens, and then it relaxes by untwisting. So we can see here in this picture, this is a single smooth muscle cell. And then when it contracts, how it twists and shortens like this. And that concludes our notes for today. Make sure you go back and answer that essential question about what smooth and cardiac muscle have in common that is completely different than skeletal muscle. All right, see you next time.